Welcome to the Salience Podcast, where we identify what stands out from all the noise.
On the Salience Podcast today, we're exploring feedback and feedforward in the complex space of international development. I'm joined in this episode by my friend Milica Begovic, who is the head of strategic innovation at the United Nations Development Program. Millie and her colleagues are pioneering new ways of doing development that build countries' capacity to deliver change at scale. She has been involved in a number of bold initiatives, such as the Accelerator Labs, which recently grew to 90 countries globally. And this on top of a number of ongoing activities at the corporate and the regional level. Today, we will be learning more about what strategic innovation means and the feedback and feed-forward loops, as well as innovative monitoring, evaluation, and learning approaches that Millie has observed and mobilized to support their work. Welcome, Millie.
Thank you so much, Jen, for having me. Really excited about this conversation today.
Yes, me too. Now, before we start exploring the main topic, I'd really love to find out more about what strategic innovation is, what marks it from innovation in general, and how this sort of came about.
Right. So when the team was named Strategic Innovation, we had a informal conversation with a partner, and she said, "Duh, of course it should be strategic innovation." But what that actually means, and I know that we will get into more details during the conversation, is that a large chunk of our work with innovation in UNDP at the beginning was really premised on this idea that if we bring a lot more methods into UNDP that can help us see different aspects of the problem, we might be able to make the dial move on some of the really difficult policy issues. And that was successful in some ways that we'll get to speak about. But in others, it didn't really get to the root causes of those problems. So as we pivoted from one side of the continuum to the other, we also wanted to differentiate ourselves as a team, and we changed the name to Strategic Innovation.
Just to help the listeners a little bit, what was the thing that marked the difference between what you were doing before and how you transitioned into this strategic innovation space?
Yes, that's actually a fair point. So may as well start. So the innovation at UNDP goes back to about 2012. And our intent at that point in time was really to move from, there is a problem and somebody has an idea, to actually putting that idea into action and learning whether it works or how it works, to collapse the time that it would take between those two things to happen. And the way we've done that was to introduce things like rapid prototyping, experimentation, and a series of methods such as, design thinking, various forms of crowdfunding, futures and foresight, and what have you. And the idea was bring in different perspectives, upskill and uptool our own staff, our partners, be able to see different aspects of the problem and move quickly. One of the then partners of ours from the Danish government said that, this type of innovation is like throwing a grenade into bureaucracy, or kind of challenging the established systems and trying to find entry points to sort of rethink them. But so again, the premise was on speed. The premise was on kind of technical aspects of innovation. And that worked that had a number of positive externalities. I think for us specifically, it led to the organization investing into what remains the largest learning network on the planet, which is a network of Accelerator Labs. And this has been supported by a number of different partners. Governments and partners on the ground really like it, see it as a big value to the work that they do. But as we were kind of going around that trajectory, some of the feedback that we were getting from our partners was that innovation is about speed, but it's also about direction. In other words, if we kind of mindlessly copy a Silicon Valley approach, chances are the inequality, there is research enough now to show that type of a model really leads to higher inequalities. We spoke with Dan Bresnitz just recently. He wrote a book called Innovation in Real Places, where he kind of looked at some of those models and how they play into practice, and kind of showed, unless there is this really delicate dance between public policy and public funding supporting the assets and know-how and homegrown enterprises, the chances of investment coming in and going out quickly is that much higher. That innovation is technical, but it is also very political. Change is very political, and if we don't address some of those if we don't acknowledge and work with some of those entrenched interests, things don't happen. So what we've done as an organization was to invest in the other side of the continuum and kind of balance incremental and strategic innovation, and say, okay, so we're getting better and kind of understanding how this sort of fast technical type of innovation happens. The question is, what are the conditions under which true change can happen, and we can rethink the systems that underpin development. And that type of a journey really kind of moves at dual track. One track is looking at ourselves. Who are we? What is our own organizational DNA relative to sort of system change? And then what does this look like outside with our partners? So in other words, we are not in traffic. We are the traffic. All of us are part of the problem. So that's how our journey around strategic innovation really started. And as a team, it put us in a very different space. Whereas originally, a lot of our work took place in communities with colleagues who work on policy advice and programs and projects. Here, that continues to happen, but there is another track that really looks at organizational change. So kind of looking at the what and the how of development and public policy.
No, that's amazing. You've covered so much there. I've taken a bunch of notes, and I want to circle back to some of this later on. But but before we go there, I really want to understand how it is you came about getting into the space, because now you and I met, I think, probably about 10 years ago now, in New York at the Finch's conversation that you panel, which was, I think, the start of a lot of this thinking around what marks the difference between social innovation in the development space and innovation investment in like a Silicon Valley environment. Now, it's a very unique career pathway that not many people get into. I would really love to understand how it is that you got into the space of international development.
Yeah, so I think as a whole, I've been very, very lucky and very privileged. My grandfather was a part of the first UN peacekeeping mission. So I grew up with UN Blue, and I grew up with the values and principles of the United Nations. And since I can remember myself, I have wanted to work for the United Nations, and I have wanted to be a peacekeeper. Now, the way that actually translated into some life's choices is that the schools that I went to really kind of focus on international relations, conflict and crisis, and public sector administration. And with the dream and an idea that would be a good trampoline to kind of catapult me into the field of development. And I've been lucky to first work for the OSCE, Organization for Security and Cooperation of Europe, and then be really, really fortunate at the point in time where Montenegro got renewed its independence. I was part of the team who set up the first UN resident coordination office in Montenegro. So I was there for about a year, and then started working for UNDP, which is where I stayed through now. And within the first couple of years, I got infected with the innovation bug, and just have kind of stayed with it since.
No, that's clearly someone with a clear life calling. That's fantastic. And as you're aware, we're speaking about feedback and feedforward loops in this season. And I feel like what you've described there is a very clear sort of feedforward loop that, it's not that it told you exactly what you were going to be doing, but it provided, in your words, right, the direction of where you wanted to chart your path forward. Granted, that it wasn't a straight path, right? But you had a general sense of direction. And I think that that's really useful to have, because what I heard in what you shared earlier is a lot of the early work around innovation was around shortening the plan to implementation gap, right? How do we actually move more quickly? So a lot of the focus was on speed, as opposed to really figuring out the directionality, managing that the fact that change is political, and that you really have to again understand that it's around the conditions that support that change rather than the directing the change per se. Those are very interesting sort of combinations of sort of things that you've learned, and also how then you're starting to shape the environment of UNDP's strategic innovation going forward. Now, in your Medium site, and I highly recommend all of our users actually visit the Medium site. We're going to pop it into the description. You actually describe that this led to this very interesting pivot, right? So you describe this as the move from a project-driven sort of approach to something that is more portfolio-driven. And I would love to chat a little bit about that. How would you describe that shift from project to portfolio? And what are the key differences in the approaches? What are some key experience or turning points that really inspired this shift? Because I think it's quite a different approach to things.
Yeah, so the project to portfolio became a kind of a handy shorthand for us to kind of indicate what this is, with quite a lot. I mean, when you double click on that, there is a lot underneath. If I were to paint it in a very kind of simple distinction, and we kind of borrowed this from a colleague from Vinova. He makes this point between there are different types of problems, right? On one hand, a government might work to reduce the time it takes somebody to get their driver's license, right? And by 30%, say. And this is important. This is user experience. This is trust between citizens and the government, trust in public services, that they're efficient and that the public funding and taxes are being used well, and what have you. On the other side, there's a type of problem that says, how might we rethink mobility in the city that makes cars redundant, right? So it's not that one problem is better than the other. It's not that one problem is more important than another. It's a different order. It's a different type of problems that require different approaches, different mindsets, and very different understandings of the world, right? In terms of reducing the time to get your driver's license, there's very few unknowns. We can look at what that process looks like now. We can understand where are the possibilities to collapse it. We can work with citizens and what have you. So you can build almost an SOP, standard operating procedure, in terms of how to do that. Now, if you talk about how do we make cars redundant, first of all, this is going to depend on which city you're talking about, which country you're talking about. There will not be one single solution. Every action is going to have a kind of an unforeseen reaction to it. It's no matter what type of expertise and money you bring to the table, ultimately things will grind at the point when politics comes in and entrenched interests and power relationships come in. And it's a type of problem where we need to acknowledge that, we simply don't know. We don't know what actions might lead to this. We don't know what are the possible outcomes that might result from those actions. And it's very difficult to put value on different outcomes, or rather different constituents might put different values on those outcomes. So if you take those two types of problems, project is a vehicle, log frame that basically says what are the inputs that we need to get certain outputs, is kind of an artifact of certainty. It's an artifact of our belief that the world is predictable. And if we only have enough and the right type of inputs, the outputs would come along. So this is why the project was a handy, I've met many development practitioners who take a project as an instrument and hack it to make it more flexible, more adaptable. So that's not the point. The point is what the project as an artifact stands for. And then we said, if we really want to become an organization that's better at tackling the, making cars redundant type of problem, the means to get us there, we would need to evolve a project into something else. And that something else for us became a portfolio. And by portfolio, what we mean in UNDP is a set of interconnected interventions that learn from each other and that continually evolve. And there is a number of parts there that we can dig into. The work with Luca Gatti and Cora Foundation has really been instrumental for us. The work with Dave Snowden and you over time has really built a strong basis that made some of this work, that triggered some of this work and made it move faster, I believe. But very quickly, it led us to sort of see that this type of work is not just about developing different policies or different interventions. It's about a whole different set of issues that talk about, the rules of engagement. How do we do development? So we can get into that a little bit more, but I'll stop for now because I think I've talked a lot on this one.
No, this is fantastic because, again, when people start to think about intervening in a complex space like that of development sector, they're always thinking, how do I learn from what's happening? There is the feedback loops from the project team to the ground. So what are the constituents thinking? What are beneficiaries saying, right? But what I'm hearing from you is that you have very purposefully created these feedback and feedforward loops between project teams in a more coordinated and consolidated portfolio approach. So these teams are aware of each other. They're aware of the need to coordinate across each other. And how then, do those learnings, because I think that there are a lot of communities of practice that are trying to simulate this type of approach, right? But I think for them, the problem is really there's a lot of learning, but again, it's the learning to doing, the learning doing gap for them, right, seems to be one that is hard to bridge. But clearly you guys have been very effectively activating these very interesting feedback, feed forward into implementation loops. I'd really love to understand, the examples of how you're doing that.
It's a very timely question because we've just done a bit of a post-mortem on how did we get to where we are. So I think there are 4 building blocks that now, with hindsight, I think as we were doing it, it really felt like crossing the river by feeling the stones a little bit. But now there may be 4 blocks that really kind of surface. So one, we started at the place where for us as an organization has the most consequence, which is the field. Our teams on the ground are closest to the problems that we as the UN address. They have the disintermediated connection and relationship with communities and the partners. So this was the beginning of this work, going into the field and trying to understand what are the ways in which system and portfolio approaches can really support our teams on the ground to be better at what they do. Now, and that is the bread and butter of what we do. And for us, the really interesting bit was to see that, and UNDP is not different to any other development organization, and really any other public organization, insofar that public administration reform and the way the bureaucracies are structured, the way institutions work, are very much into waterfall organograms, silos and fragments to be able to manage them better. There's a great book, Seen Like a State, that basically says in order for the state to govern, we need to be able to read the system, and therefore we need to be able to count every tree. And that is the fastest way to kill the forest. Right? So this is not surprising, but what we found is that there was just a set of projects that manifest the quality and competence of our staff on the ground, because they were able to quickly turn, their relationships and insights with communities into bankable projects where they were able to get investment and do something on the ground. But doing it in that way led to number of different teams that were ultimately looking at different aspects of the problem without necessarily having something that will help compound them and connect them. So that was the start. Now, as you point out, we quickly needed to put some stuff around that practice that was starting to emerge as to be able to both accelerate it, as in get more people to come around and start practicing this new craft, but also be able to start tweaking the structural elements that sort of hamper this work. So the other three building blocks that we've put in place is one, ecosystem and community building and management. And that meant two things, right? Internally, we very quickly started putting a spotlight on the champions, making sure that they get kudos for the work that they're doing, but also making sure that they can connect to each other to compare notes and accelerate learning. So the internal piece really served the purpose of showing who the sort of front runners are, but also connecting them to the decision makers in the organization, both to be able to collapse the hierarchy between, so the decision makers can quickly get insights from the field, but also to show the political support behind this work. The external community was our effort to bring in organizations and people outside UNDP who were looking at the same questions. And again, this served two purposes. One, sort of showing political commitment and that there is movement out there around this craft, which is not fully developed or codified. So everybody's kind of looking at the same questions, but from a very different way. And two, to bring in different perspectives and different expertise to our partners and to our sort of colleagues in the field. So this was one big piece that very quickly we initiated as to be able to start seeing the patterns, right, across the signals of change. The second one, and this might sound funny, and we certainly did not think about it at the beginning, was to start building some products. In other words, once we moved from a couple of teams to about 20, 25 teams, this kind of reinforced the momentum and got others in the organization and partners to say, this portfolio thing, what is it? Initially, we were just writing emails and sharing blog posts and said, read this, talk to this person. But it came to a point where we realized we needed a different way of engaging others that would be less cognitively expensive. So you don't have to read 15 blog posts and talk to 15 people. Here is a process that is evolving from this practice on the ground. If you want to do this yourself, here is steps 1, 2, 3, 4. The products really did a couple of things in terms of both feedback and feed forward. In terms of feed forward, we started seeing teams and partners take them and make sense of them in their own context. And it was interesting because we started learning things that we hadn't thought about. We basically allowed more decentralized tweaking of this or appropriation of the craft. That was one. And the second aspect is it generated more interest, right? So this was the second block. And then the third piece, which is really fundamental. I mean, all of these three kind of work in tandem, but the last bit was a kind of an institutional sandbox. We were lucky enough to generate quite a bit of political support in the organization and from some key partners around this work that the space created for us to actually start changing things in the HR department, with legal department, around M&E, looking at different ways of finance. And this is where things really started to change. So we are on the cusp. I hope that by the time this podcast is out, the first portfolio policy in UNDP will be approved and teamed, which basically codifies this practice from the ground that now over 53 countries have been working on, and that policy provides a legal instrument for UNDP to program and partner around development. And this is very exciting. So these are a few things that we've been putting in place that come together. So the insights and practice from the field informs the organizational change. And if we read research on how change happens, how different business models evolve, this kind of validates what research shows, which is that the changes really start being felt on the front lines and in the field, on the edges of the organization. And for us, some of these building blocks were really a mechanism to start translating that into change within the organization, with a big caveat that this is UNDP changing, where I believe we will start seeing the biggest changes when we get the trifecta: government, donors, and development organizations changing together.
Mm-hmm. I mean, what you have attempted, are attempting currently, ambitiously pushing forward on is such a sort of complex intermingling of things, and again, with your reach across, like, however many countries, 100 over countries, right? What are some ways in which you're keeping, your finger on the pulse for how things are happening? What are some of the indicators that you watch for to know that, this system that you're trying to weave together is actually moving in the right direction?
It's a really interesting question, because I think, and I don't have a clever answer, Jen, to that one. I can just sort of tell you how we are thinking about it, because I think, the change is really happening on a number of different levels, right? So there is something that is happening on the level of a country, where a UNDP team, together with a number of partners, is looking to support a government of Philippines or Bosnia and Herzegovina to pursue just circular transition, right? So that's one level of change. I think another level of change is kind of understanding how do different ways of working on the country level, what types of frictions are they surfacing around, how do we organize ourselves differently? How do we finance development differently? How do we hire different type of profiles? How do we build different type of capabilities? So this is, I think, the different type of a level. And then I think as a whole, something that we've started kind of considering is, pivoting from, are we coordinating? In other words, are, 3 different organizations simply aligning our activities around common goal? Are we pivoting from that towards cooperation, if you mean by cooperation, sharing resources for a common purpose, right? To collaborating, meaning, are we committing together to achieve a common goal? Now, these are nuances, but I think what sits at the heart of that nuance is the question of identity. What we see now is that there's lots of different organizations who have very kind of fragmented identities. So you've got development banks, you've got private sector, you've got universities, you've got the government, you've got development sector, or looking at different aspects of shift to a circular economy. Coming to a point where we can jointly commit to achieve a common goal, which means not just sharing resources, but also modifying some of our own work, kind of implies ceding some of our individual identity towards having a bigger impact, towards being able to pursue collectively that goal. It also means jointly holding risks in a very different type of accountability. And I think this type of a change is probably the one that's most difficult to get to. And I think one of the insights that we've seen, so there's a political side of things, right? Every organization has their own constraints the same way that we do, right? So what can you do within those constraints? How malleable or permeable are they? And Jeff Mulgan, for example, has been doing some really interesting framework around different institutional forms that we need to start thinking about and putting in place to allow for this type of work. And then another insight of ours has been this kind of concept of learning as currency. In a lot of organizations, I found that learning is almost like a dirty word. Learning is a thing that you kind of have to do to tick the box and get a certificate to be able to get from one year to another. And so when you mention learning, people's eyes just glaze over and they're like, oh my God, for me, this means. But what we found, if we take this difference between, the driver's license and the making cars redundant, the currency that we need to trade in is learning, meaning how quickly can we extrapolate what we're individually learning into what do we do collectively next. That has been a big, obviously a big insight from the ground. There's a bunch of examples around this, right? So we worked in one country where there was a big push to formalize informal workers, and no women applied. It was all men. And the Minister of Economy I don't understand, why. It was the health unit who actually came in and said, look, it's too risky for women to be part of the formal economy because one, childcare services are not dependable, and in some cases they simply don't exist. And in many households in this country, women take care of the sick and take care of the retired, elderly in the family. So for them, informal economy is the only way to be able to come in and out as the household responsibilities can allow. Now, that meant a very different relationship between the Minister of Economy and her peers. How can we co-locate some of the services closer to where, women are likely to work or where they do have informal economy? Now, this is not innovation, right? This is being clever about public services. But what is a hack is that you're connecting pipes of learning. So there is a health team that knew something, but because they were not thinking and working together with a team who's working on economy, this insight was not able to be translated into a very sort of practical decision on the ground. So this is the type of, I think, feedback and feed forward that can help public sector and development really move on some of the big issues that we're facing.
So I want to say everything you've shared is so profound, but the thing that really struck me there is how you've created very useful ways of defining the difference between coordination, cooperation, and collaboration. Because so often those words are used interchangeably, and people throw those terms out to say, yes, we need to be more collaborative, but without really going back to qualify what they mean by those things. And how you framed it, right? The joint holding of risk, the building of learning pipes across, and how they can influence decision making, and how things are taken to ground, to implementation, right? I think that, it really creates that profound difference between just saying that we're collaborating, which I think according to your definition is really more around coordination. We're aligning our activities, but there's no real collaboration or genuine learning outcome that comes from it, right? To moving that needle toward greater collaborative sort of environmental conditions and structures that enable that, right? Now I'm thinking again about your fabulous medium site, and so I think if we're moving again at this speed of learning, which you've described, it requires a lot of rethinking around the organization works. And in your blog posts, you've described that move from starting as an organization wanting to create more verticals into the field, because that's the point of greater impact, right? You can see how your constituents are experiencing the difference as quickly as possible, to then recognizing, no, if we're doing this vertical outreach, we need to also look at our horizontals across the organization. And as you've mentioned, you're now starting to get to the space where you can influence HR, you can influence legal, which is very exciting. And I would really love to, tell me how this is happening, what inspired it, like really get under the hood of this.
Yeah. So on the coordination, cooperation, and collaboration, I have to reference Rodin Genoff, who is a friend of our team. I credit him for us being able to get a bit nuanced with that, because it matters. We found that it really matters, and it helps a group of people really kind of look at it and very quickly be able to, it's almost like reflecting the system back to itself, self-diagnose where they are, and sort of start coming up with ways to move, sort of like the way we make sense of micro narratives with Dave, as it were. Right. So when it comes to the horizontals, again, this was a bit of an aha. And in retrospect, it's blindingly obvious and common sense, right? But very quickly, we realized that, the work around developing a portfolio of interventions that helps a country shift to a circular economy. Big part of it is obviously being able to see what those interventions are. But we quickly realized that work is necessary, but not sufficient. Where the whole system grinds is when we look at those horizontals, and that's the human resources, that's the procurement, that's the legal, that's all of these other aspects, and really because of the identity of the team in the first phase of innovation, we haven't had that much connection or opportunity to work with colleagues in these teams at all. And for me, sort of professionally, a really rewarding part of the last few years has been, understanding how much both interest and competence, but also space for innovation in some of those areas, which are traditionally, you don't think of, when you think of innovation, you don't think legal. When you think of innovation, you don't think procurement. Whereas when you make changes there, that you start seeing this massive result of it. So we were lucky and very pleased to see that ability to take insights from the field has created the space to start looking into some of those horizontals. And the ones that have been very prominent for us were understanding impact, monitoring and evaluation frameworks. So what we've done is we realized that there is a lot of people, because development is so decentralized, there's a lot of people under the radar who are experimenting with whole different ways of doing M&E for a number of different reasons. So we set up an M&E sandbox that quickly attracted over 300 organizations, which for us was a very big surprise, that it seems that what's common to us all, that we all feel the pain in inability to distill signal from noise, to be able to understand what does the change look like in an intermediate period while we pursue long-term goals, and how does that change what we do and who we are and what have you. So the M&E side of things has been one prominent area of work. Here, Gates Foundation has stepped in and supported this work, because for them, they come from the similar set of, from the similar perspective. They said there is a lot of stuff out there. How do we actually translate it so it's useful and valuable to practitioners on the ground? Finance is another piece. So there are organizations like Transcap, who's doing some fascinating work around system finance. And it's not just about money, but what is the governance of funding when the investment thesis cannot immediately tell you what the change is going to be. How does that change? When you look at a river, not just as a medium of transporting goods from one side of the city to another, but the river as something that purifies air, increases well-being of the society, and so on and so forth. So finance is the second piece. We're working on a system finance facility in this regard to support the portfolio work and the work with emergence. The third one I spoke briefly about, which is a portfolio policy, which to my understanding, and I could be wrong, and if I am wrong, I would be really happy to be corrected and speak to an organization that has a portfolio policy themselves, a portfolio policy that not just looks at aggregating things for the purpose of efficiency, which is very important and necessary, but also putting in place a system that continually evolves interventions and changes the way we work. And that is a legal instrument that in a way institutionalizes this practice that has been growing in UNDP for the last 3 years. And I'm really excited to see, we've been working on it for the last couple of months. And I'm really interested to see how it actually rolls out, because everything that we have been doing so far has led to it. So the policy in a way legitimizes, if I can say that without being misunderstood, legitimizes all of the work that 51, 52 countries have been doing over the last 2-3 years. Now that it becomes a public good, as it were, not just for other UNDP offices and teams, but also for partners who might be interested in being able to invest money in more efficient ways for, more superior results. Ultimately, that is the holy grail. This whole work around portfolios is really meant to give us better results on the ground. And then probably the last bucket is around competencies in learning. So for us as UNDP, very quickly we've come to this question of, do we buy these capabilities or do we build them? And that is a choice. That is a choice that has significant implications in terms of resources and support and what have you. And the decision was to, let's build them. This is foundation. This is the type of organization that we want to do. So there was a whole set of things that came up as a result of us looking at that horizon.
I love that. So there is quite a big commitment into capability building, competency building within, what you're doing right now. And I think that this is where, if you've shared such an amazing summary of what has been a very long learning journey. And if I was, for example, a new manager looking to say, yes, I want to incorporate this type of thinking, this type of framework into my organization, right? How do I do that? Could you share a little bit what type of competencies, we should be thinking about building or hiring into the organization to actually promote this new way of thinking?
Yes. So I think it's worth listing a few organizations who have been an inspiration to us on this journey. So Climate KIC has been really inspiring. Mariana Mazzucato's and Rainer Kattel's IIPP out of London. Danish Design Center, Lagire Center in the Basque region. So there are a few organizations who we've really, and I've mentioned Cora Foundation, have been instrumental for us to learn from and kind of find our own UNDP flavor to system and portfolio approaches. And then out of this, what we've developed, one of those horizontals was portfolio competency framework. And it really kind of hangs on three big pieces, as in three defining areas that for us are the biggest difference between more sort of linear approaches to development versus, bringing complexity in systems into development. And they are, one, being able to see what's hidden, being able to hear what's not said, being able to get to root causes of the problem, not the symptoms. And that's a mix of capacities. The other one is political will to change. And we use those words intentionally. If you double click on them, what it gets at is, how do you reconfigure relationships within your team, relationship with your partners, relationships with communities, where you move at the speed of trust, where you acknowledge this is a long-term change that goes beyond strategic plans and administrations. So, somebody can look at it and say politically naive, but the history proves us wrong. Some of these problems have been enduring throughout. So that's the second set of competencies. How do you create the political space and will to change? And then the third set of competencies is about working with emergence. And what that means is continually evolving, turning learning into decision-making and new interventions and ways of being. So the competency framework hangs around these three big blocks. And now we are, with the portfolio policy, we're actually moving to hopefully prototype a way of being and a way of working that can actually put those competencies into practice. And we've been inspired by Von Ten's work. He's written the Uncertainty Mindset book and is now writing a book about not knowing. I would encourage the readers to go look up this work because it's absolutely fascinating. So he's in his first book, in the Uncertainty Mindset, he looked at the R&D teams of some of the best chefs in the world. And he showed how by having open roles So by acknowledging, so if you have a kind of a fixed terms of reference where you hire somebody and you tell them these are the things that you're going to do and these and only these and that's it, you freeze the organization in one point in time. But if instead you build, so position versus role, if you build a role that has aspects of it that will change as the work changes, it allows the person itself to pursue certain professional interests that might be aligned with the direction that the work is taking place. And there's something that he calls a role negotiation, where within the team, you can kind of test and try and work on things that again align with this way of working. So I think this is where we would, and HR colleagues have been absolutely fantastic. It has been one of the most rewarding collaborations that we've had so far for me, because we're working with two aspects of HR. The open roles side is the organizational design side of things. And then there is part of the house that does talent development for UNDP. And with these guys, the type of work that we've done, for example, is working with the Center for Performance Studies in London, where we put some of our partners and directors in the room with, magicians, combat pilots, surgeons, under the premise that there are rules of thumb and insights that you can learn from other disciplines around how do you manage people in contexts of high uncertainty and stress. How do you influence and build relationships in contexts when you might have 20% of information, and so on and so forth. So it's been a really, really rewarding side of this work.
And those sound like very interesting training programs. I'm sure many people would love to be sent on those. And I have read The Uncertainty Mindset. It's a very well written book, very entertaining, full of amazing anecdotes. So I mean, you've shared so much, and I wish that we had more time to chat. But I know that given the time constraints, I'd really like to again come back to you. We started with your journey into the space. I want to understand your future aspirations now in work and also elsewhere in your life. Like, if you could think about where your attention goes to, where does that lead you?
That's a good question. So maybe two answers. Personally and privately, I suppose I would love to travel to every country on this planet with my two kids. I have a 13 and 9-year-old, and they're absolutely fantastic. They've graduated from teeny tiny diaper toddler stage that I did not enjoy so much. I mean, I've had village helping raise them, but now they're in a stage where they're curious and interesting and have opinions, and so this is one for the bucket list. Professionally, what really interests me is how institutions change and need to change for the world that we live in. I think, amazingly enough, a lot of different areas of work and sectors have advanced. If you look at architecture, if you look at energy, if you look at health, if you look at, obviously, technology, there has been so much progress over the last decade, or, I mean, let's just take since the first iPhone came out, right? So much progress. But if you look at our institutions as a way to organize knowledge and resources to increase the well-being of communities and citizens, we have not really made progress as species. And this is the one bit that really, really interests me. And I hope that in the years to come, professionally, I can spend time learning and speaking to people who are much smarter than me in this regard.
Oh, this is fantastic, Millie. You've shared so much. Thank you so much. And part of our podcast, at the end of our chats with each guest, is we try our best. And I'm really struggling here. I've taken so many notes to summarize it into 3 salient points. So I have so many, but I'm going to try my best. Okay. So the first one that really, I think we started with is the importance of recognizing that change or innovation, as organizations seek to transform to become more future fit, right? We have to focus on speed, but also more importantly is direction, right? We need to be changing in the right direction, not just changing quickly for the sake of it. I really like that. I really love the fact that you also say it's not just about, the change itself, but the direction and managing the conditions around that. Right, that change is political, and we have to actually lean into actively supporting that political will to change as well. So for me, that was the one of the standout ones. The other one that really stood out to me was that very interesting distinction that you made that I think we could all learn from. That you credit to your friend, and I might ask you later on for a list of these resources so that we can pop them into the description. Yeah, so it's just that fantastic one, where you talk about the difference between merely coordinating activities to cooperating, sharing resources for common purpose, to actual collaboration where you're taking on shared risk. You have shared accountability toward achieving common goals, right? I really loved that one. And the third one there, I really, so many, I'm trying to figure out which one is the right one to put in, but I think this bit about, learning as currency, right? Learning shouldn't be the nice side effect of something. Learning should essentially drive the innovation, right? We are learning to innovate, but we're also innovating to learn and creating that really nice, tight feedback loop, and then creating the conditions in the environment where that learning to doing gap is minimized, right? I think that is a really key and important thing. So for me, those are my best attempt at 3 salient points.
It's impressive.
So, no, I mean, thank you so much for sharing all of your wonderful wisdom of what has been, I understand, a very long and intense learning journey. So really appreciate your generosity with the sharing.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. This was fantastic. It was a lot of fun.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of the Salience Podcast. Please leave us a review and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. You can also subscribe to the Frontline Mind newsletter by visiting our website at frontlinemind.com. Have you got a topic you would like some more salience on? Send us a message on LinkedIn or email team@frontlinemind.com.